This is Monica Perez, and today we are hitting the fourth part of Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas P. Neal, PhD. It is part four. The first part one and part two were Luther. These are the 12 makers of the modern mind, the 12 men who put together kind of account for how we think. There are people who are very influential, but as far as taking, a Venn diagram of not super overlapping circles, the other ones would be overlapping somewhat. This kind of is, he said, the most efficient way to do it. Luther, from what I could get, the Luther part was because you would be saved by faith alone. Behavior wasn't like strict rules of behavior wasn't really the measure of a man. And I kind of rolled in a kind of subjective morality, according to Neal, I think, if I got that right. Then part three, and now part four, is Calvin with the Protestant work ethic, of which I was definitely raised with. And Neal says that Calvin wouldn't like it, but the way it got morphed into today is kind of justifying the anything goes kind of financial capitalism, like all the way to, what do they call it? Homo economicus, whatever. So we are up to the second part of Calvin. And I assume that's where Neal is going to bring it home. Like, yes, this is the influence Calvin had on the modern mind. So let's hit it. The Reform of Geneva turned out to be Calvin's minor contribution to history. Geneva was only a place where his ideas were put on the statute books and where life conformed to them. It was his ideas that were really effective, ideas which he spread by preaching and writing, ideas which were carried forth from Geneva by zealous missionaries into the four corners of Europe. It was Calvin's body of doctrine that sustained the men of the Protestant revolt, that made them martyrs when they were weak and tyrants when they were strong, that gave them amazing confidence in themselves and disdainful disgust for all who disagreed with them. Okay, so yeah, this is from the mid 1500s. Calvin sent out from Geneva the Ironsides of the Protestant movement, men with souls of steel, men convinced of the rightness of their cause and of the necessity of sacrificing everything for its success. These are the men whom Preserved Smith characterizes as, quote, a strong and good race, believing themselves chosen vessels and elect instruments of grace. They could neither be seduced by carnal pleasure nor awed by human might. Taught that they were kings by the election of God and priests by the imposition of his hands, they despised the puny and vicious monarchs of this earth. They remained, in fact, what they always felt themselves to be, an elite, the chosen few. Armed with Calvinist ideas, they conquered the world of weak mortals and strong natural forces before them. They subdued and slaughtered the Indians in this country, never asking whether they had claim to the land on which they lived. They put the head of Charles I on the block because he tried to rule the chosen few as he did the millions of lost souls. They toppled Mary Stuart off the throne of Scotland because she did not respect the covenant of the Scottish Presbyterians. They underpaid their workers to keep them sober and worked them 16 hours a day to keep them out of temptation's way. Their confidence, their energy, their ruthlessness were never shaken, even momentarily, by the disquieting suspicion that they might be wrong, or by the annoying suggestion that even the damned might have rights against the elect. They were a race of iron men clothed in an armor none in modern times could penetrate, the armor of Calvin's ideology. This is a point which the French syndicalist Sorel thoroughly appreciated late in the 19th century when he tried to furnish his followers with an equally invulnerable set of ideas. He refers respectfully, almost reverently, to the Huguenots of France and to their Calvinist brethren everywhere as the only men in modern times who were armed with a, quote, myth, which, Sorel explains, is a body of ideas accepted instinctively without being subjected to rational criticism. It is an ideology, in Calvin's case, which of its very nature is a pure assertion, but an ideology capable of arousing its possessors to irrational, heroic action by identifying their views with the highest truth and the highest good, and with the judgment of God Himself. Such a body of doctrine Calvin forged, not so much by creating new articles of belief as by systematically arranging a collection of doctrines his predecessors had already popularized. He briefed others' ideas into an almost irrefutable case for the Reformed faith. It is too much to agree with Palm and many other historians who assert that, quote, there is not one original thought in any of Calvin's works. But they're close to right. Calvin seems to have only one really original idea. It was, however, the basic point of his theology, his concept of the absolute sovereignty of an arbitrary God. Calvin's God is anthropomorphic, made to the image and likeness of man. The man who modeled for Calvin's God was Machiavelli's prince, the despot who ruled absolutely, amorally, arbitrarily. For Calvin posits an almighty, unlimited God like that of the Catholics before him. But whereas the Catholics had stressed God's intelligence and necessary justice, Calvin stressed his will, a will which he made as arbitrary, as erratic as the earthly despot's whim. The will of God, he wrote, is the highest rule of justice. What he wills must be considered just for this very reason that he wills it. Therefore, when it is asked why the Lord did so, the answer must be because he would. End quote. Harry says, wow, this guy hates Calvin. I know, it's like, I remember reading this a long time ago and not, and just not, I kind of thought the guy was like wishy-washy, because I'm always looking for them to expose the truth that some of these guys were put up to it, or fostered by an elite that benefited from it. Like, I always want somebody to spell it out. So when this guy didn't, I remember thinking back, like, yeah, he wasn't that hard hitting, but man, he just does not like these guys. And I can understand it. I mean, he is, I guess, coming from a super Catholic place, but that doesn't mean that he's not right in his assessment of how these guys impacted the modern mind. I mean, right? We've moved away from the medieval or Middle Ages Catholic. I would say it was even Platonic, but I think worldview of kind of where the question of the existence of God was unaskable. You didn't even think about it that way. So something really big changed, and it had to have started, I would say, there, from the sovereignty of the church, the Catholic Church, and its sovereignty. And so, okay, well, here's the next sentence. This sovereign God rules the world exactly as he pleases, and it is not for man to inquire into the nature of God's rule or into its justice. See, this is another attack on rationality. So that is true. Like, I think that about Catholic stuff. You can accept it or reject it, and it's like an awful lot of stuff if it's spun out of whole cloth. I mean, it might be, but it's definitely coherent and rational, maybe to a fault. Especially, I think, when like it went to Aquinas and Aristotle and stuff. But that would be part of the schism. Christians had, till Calvin's day, insisted that God could, of his very nature, do no injustice, no evil. For such action would be self-contradictory. Yes, that is what I was raised to believe. Like a circle being square. Calvin's God, however, does not seem to be limited to doing what is reasonable, just, and good. He does whatever he wants, and there seems no way of knowing what he will want. See, yes, Aquinas was into Aristotle, not Plato. So I'm saying that the transition was like the Platonic thing where you had the church that owned half the land, that was like a commune. You'd send your sons and they would find among them the philosopher kings, or, the Pope or whatever. And then I feel like, I could be wrong, but it started to, once you had this stuff like the Reformation, and where the state would started taking the land from the church, started establishing their own state religions, getting kind of doubling their power instead of dividing their power. And then I think it was around then, I could look it up, but I'm not saying historically, but like just my feeling is that was Platonic. That was like Plato was the collective. And then they moved to Aristotle for better or worse. I always liked Aristotle because I felt like the power is in the person who's making the decision. So the individual has to be the ultimate person who has responsibility, like not the collective. The collective is not like society itself is not the basic unit of society. The individual is. And I would say that's Aristotle. And I feel like that was Aquinas. And I feel like that was after this. But I have to check the dates, and I don't have my laptop with me. Let's check the dates. I hate to do this during a reading. Thomas Aquinas, 1274. So let's see. This is way after that. So maybe it was the other way. Maybe it was moving towards Aristotle that weakened that collectivist force, that Platonic force of the medieval church. And maybe that in itself was, because I do remember thinking that I've read, and it could have been the Webster Tarpley stuff about the Black nobility in Italy, that they wanted it to go to a more what we would call libertarian bent. It was better for them. So it could be that this stuff would never have been able to take any kind of hold if that breach had not already been committed. But I'm out of my depth. Did the author actually read Calvin, or is he just projecting later developments onto Calvin? You know, there is a robust index here. And I can probably answer your question. Let's see if it's just by page. Oosh, Calvinism. This is an index. What I need is a bibliography, which I don't have. It does not have a bibliography. So I'm assuming that he read. My guess is this is real potboiler stuff. So I would suspect that he did not do primary research, but took the works of others, synthesized it, and came up with these coherent narratives. You know, the narratives that hold together, whether or not you agree with them. Okay. The Christian God of mercy becomes in Calvin's hands a tyrant whose sole concern is his own satisfaction and glory. This is the God that came to hold sway throughout most of the Protestant world after Calvin's day, the God against whom moderns react when they consider the problem of evil. For Calvin's God apparently enjoys watching his hateful creatures squirm in anguish here below. This is why so mild-mannered a man as John Stuart Mill can label the Calvinistic God loathsome and write of him, if such a being can sentence me to hell I will go. Such is Calvin's God. Man's relation to him is simple, for man exists only to glorify God. This is his only purpose in life. His soul is already predestined either to heaven or to hell, and man can do nothing to change the label God has put on him. I never understand this predestination. It just negates free will. And it sounds like Luther and Calvin both believe that. He was created, in fact, not for his own salvation, but for God's glory, which he promotes by his suffering, if he be of the reprobate, and by his prosperity, if he be of the elect. God has, however, laid down certain rules of worship, and these are to be found in the Bible. Man, therefore, has the obligation to glorify God by worshiping him in the way God has chosen and shown to mankind. To worship God in any other way, or to worship a false God, is the worst of all sins. For Calvin tells us the first foundation of righteousness is certainly the worship of God. And if this be destroyed, all the other branches of righteousness, like the parts of a disjointed and falling edifice, are torn asunder and scattered. And again, he writes, whatever crimes can be thought of do not come up to this. That is, when God himself is involved in such dishonor as to be made an abettor of falsehood, now to corrupt pure doctrine, is it not the same as if to put the devil in God's place? I have to say, this idea of worship So with the Catholics, I mean, I was raised to behave like certain behaviors, the 10 commandments, look to the beatitudes, look at the vices and the virtues, the seven deadly sins, and especially to corporal works of mercy and spiritual works of mercy. All this stuff is like super behavior oriented, although spiritual works of mercy are like one step removed. But the worship part, which I mean, my mother did when she could no longer do actions, I mean, for hours and hours every day, I have such a hard time with that. And to think that to trade that in, to say that that's the most important thing, I would struggle with that. Maybe this guy, the author, has a similar problem because he's Catholic and he just can't get his mind around it. Although, I mean, there's a lot of rites and rituals which are worshipful. I just find it so difficult to immerse myself in that. I think it's a failing of faith. I think if I had more faith, I would do it. But I just feel like I'd rather wash the dishes, and thank God for the ability to wash the dishes. I don't know. I could be wrong. Anyway, therefore, Calvin concludes that the mockers who would suffer all false doctrines and let anyone disgorge what he likes are not only traitors to God, but enemies of the human race. Therefore, idolatry, whether in man or woman, ought to be a mortal and capital crime. These are harsh conclusions to which Calvin comes, but they are logically harsh, for in his system, men count for nothing except as creatures made to glorify God. That would be different from Luther, who apparently thought that man was evil. How could you glorify God if he's evil? If you are evil. Theirs is never to reason why. Theirs is only to obey blindly and die. Calvin, unlike Catholic theologians before him, was not metaphysical. He did not inquire into the nature of God. He did not even admit the right to inquire. He was a legalistic religion. His was a legalistic religion laid down by an arbitrary God through his secretary and prosecuting attorney, John Calvin. Calvin was creator of the Reformed Christian religion. The exaltation of the human person, always to the fore in Christ's message, is essentially foreign to Calvinism. His stress is on the Decalogue, not on the Sermon on the Mount. What's the Decalogue? Is that not the 10 Commandments? Is that like 10 books, not the 10 Commandments? Yeah, no, that's the 10 Commandments. Okay. Not on the Sermon on the Mount. The first of Christ's two great commandments is so stressed that the second is almost forgotten. The Jehovah of the Jews presented in a distorted image. I have to look at that. Hi, Vernon. 10 Commandments. That's what I thought. Thank you, Harry. Man, it's hard to just know this stuff off the top. I mean, I understand. There was this crazy, super dark 10-part like mini series thingy called the Decalogue. And it was kind of like that movie Seven, which was the seven deadly sins. This was the 10 Commandments, but it was set in it was some famous director, but foreign. And it was set like in that brutalist architecture of Russia behind the Iron Curtain. And I mean, man, I did get quite a few through it, but it was just too depressing. I couldn't stand it. But anyway, so that's how I remember the Decalogue. That was the name of that thing. Very well done, though, if you like the darkest stuff. The Jehovah of the Jews presented in a distorted image becomes the God of Calvin, while the elect have replaced the Jews as God's chosen people. Calvin is the second Moses. Christ is not denied, but he becomes quite unimportant. Those elements of Christianity which were distinctly Christian recede into the background. God no longer loves man as his creature. He hates him as a sinner. God's justice is no longer tempered with mercy. Oh, Harry. He did say in the last chapter that Calvin himself that his message morphed quite a bit over time. I think I said that in the beginning, but that could be part of like the disconnect of why it sounds so bad. Whereas he didn't think Calvin was that bad, I think. Okay. Calvin's second basic doctrine, this one I have a problem with, was predestination, which he believed followed of necessity from his doctrine of God's absolute unlimited sovereignty. For to allow men to achieve salvation through their own efforts is to place limits on the divine sovereignty. All men deserve eternal punishment, Calvin insisted, but for his own pleasure and as a means of glorifying himself, God selected some, relatively few it would seem, for salvation. These elect have neither done anything in the past nor can they do anything in the future to deserve their selection. They are lucky in the same way that a lottery winner is lucky. For God's choice, Calvin says, is founded on his gratuitous mercy, totally irrespective of human merit. I mean, that's just a bad system. That's not going to, if religion's a total setup, the opiate of the masses, this is not the way to get it to work. More than that, those who have been selected for salvation cannot resist God's choice, nor can they do anything to make God change his mind and condemn them to eternal punishment. It is all arranged by God himself, acting with absolute independence of the creatures he has either condemned to hell or assigned to heaven. There is absolutely nothing you can do about it. It follows, therefore, that man does not possess free will. On this point, Calvin was explicit and positive. His followers, though they held men strictly accountable for their moral actions, never deviated from this view. As long as they remained Calvinist, William Prynne, Prynne, stated this belief in 2 of his 7 dogmatical conclusions of Calvinism. It was number 4, that there is not any such free will, any such universal or sufficient grace communicated unto all men, whereby they may repent, believe, or be saved if they will themselves. And 6 was that the elect do always constantly obey, nor do they or can they finally or totally resist the inward, powerful, and effectual call or working of God's Spirit in their hearts in the very act of their conversion. Neither is it in their own power to convert or not convert themselves at the very instant time when they were converted. Huh? Man in Calvin's system is a lowly creature, essentially depraved by the sin of his first parents. He is thoroughly corrupted and he is impotent even to will, much less accomplish a good act. He has been cast by God into this arena of black sin. And if he is of the elect, he must battle through this wicked world alone, unaided by other men. He is not, except incidentally, a social person. He fights for God's glory and does his will as an individual crusader who relies only upon his own resources and upon the God who has marked him for salvation. His life, Tawney Wells says, is that of a soldier in hostile territory. But can you know you are on God's side? Is there any proof that you are of the elect? This is a question that would quite naturally bother any Calvinist, and Calvin had a double answer for it. One knows if he is of the elect through, quote, the witness of the Spirit, end quote, within him, which seems to be an overwhelmingly powerful inner conviction of God's assurance that you are good and what you say is true. This witness of the Spirit, however, serves as proof only of one's own election. It does not tell you who else has been marked for salvation, who are your brethren in the company of the elect. And yet, practically speaking, with the Calvinists, a man's neighbors constituted themselves the judges of his spiritual health. All right, so you have to know your own spirit, and then you can say whether you're one of the elect, but also your neighbors make this choice. Let's see. In the second place, Calvin and his followers come to believe that prosperity in this life, I was waiting for this. This is like the dominionism thing. Yes, prosperity in this life was the best possible indication of salvation in the next. Like, this could not be more not Catholic at all. Like, Catholicism is definitely, like, being poor is evidence that you're a lot of things, I think, not materialistic, and I don't know, give stuff away. I don't know. Like, it definitely is the opposite of what I learned. The connection between worldly success and election to heaven was not necessarily foolproof, but Calvinists all came to feel that God would surely help his chosen people in their worldly pursuits, and that you could therefore adjudge a man's election to salvation by his godliness here below and by the size of his bank account. See, because that kind of stuff oftentimes provides temptation, and you ask God to lead you not into temptation. So this is just something that is a definite break. Surely, if all men are essentially wicked and hateful in the sight of God, and if God has freely marked a few for salvation, then those few must enjoy God's blessings on earth. I mean, no. Surely the good must prosper, for they have nothing else to do with their time and their energy. They are already saved, and their activity on this earth has no connection with their salvation. Calvin himself frequently stated this idea of divine favor attached to the elect. In the Institutes, he told his readers, "Whatever a man possesses has fallen to his lot not by a fortuitous contingency, but by the distribution of the supreme Lord of all. In all places," he asserts, quote, "though some seem to enrich themselves by vigilance, nevertheless it is God who blesses and cares for them. Goods sometimes come to his children as they sleep. And this shows that men err if they think they enrich themselves by their own merit. Thus, the prosperous man can congratulate himself on having found favor with God, for the good prosper, and there is no prosperity without God." But that's just like self-evidently untrue. Oh, but what he's saying is you're not elect because you're good. You're elect because you're elect, because you can see, I mean, it's pretty obvious that the super rich and powerful people are the least godly. But godliness is not the salvation, is not an indication of salvation. All right. Calvin's doctrine of predestination gave immediate impetus to wealth seeking as an end in itself. For if you know you are already consigned by God either to heaven or hell, and there is nothing you can do about it, and if you are curious about your destiny, then you will naturally concentrate very earnestly on the exterior mark of prosperity that will indicate your salvation. It will, moreover, cause you rationally to direct all your energies into worldly work, for the business of your salvation is already determined. You cannot save your soul by making $1 million, but you can obtain the comforting assurance that God is on your side and has almost certainly pinned the elect label on your soul. The absolute sovereignty of God and predestination are the two pillars of the Calvinist system. A third important point is his bibliocracy. The Bible, read literally, contains God's blueprint for the running of the universe. In it is to be found everything God had ordained for his own glory and for man's life on earth. In his hands, Calvin's hands, Rayborn states, the Bible became a manual of dogmatic theology, a directory for public worship, and a scheme of church government. Nothing in religion was permissible except what was sanctioned in Scripture or might be deduced from it by necessary inference. It was not really the Bible, but Calvin's interpretation of it that ruled Geneva. See, that's the thing. People say, well, Catholics need to read the Bible, but so it's not always crystal clear on its face. And what about the translation, where it came from? Calvin was supreme rather than the Bible for any interpretation of a scriptural passage that conflicted with Calvin's was anathema. Calvin was, people were walking around looking at for me. I forgot to tell them I was podcasting. And then the dog starts to bark. The dog's doing pretty good. He's missing a lot of teeth. And he's on Prozac. But he seems happy. He enjoyed Christmas. Okay. So the Bible served more as a constitutional check on Calvin than it did as a source of law and religion. Even as a check, the Bible was as putty in the indomitable Frenchman's hands. He interpreted what Jesus said to the adulterous woman, for example, so as to eliminate mercy altogether. It is not too far amiss to say that the Bible in Reformed churchmen's hands said what Calvin wanted it to say. To hold, then, that Geneva was a bibliocracy is correct only if you remember how strong a personal flavoring Calvin gave to his scriptural exegesis. What does exegesis mean? I'm going to have to look that up. I hate to do this to you guys, but I just can't wait till later. Exegesis. I should know that word, right? How many people know that word? Critical explanation or interpretation of a text, especially of scripture. The task of biblical exegesis. Critical explanation or interpretation of text. All right. How many people knew that? All right, we're on section 3 of the Calvin chapter. From Calvin's theological system and as from his bibliocracy came its hard ethic. For this indeed are the Calvinists best known. It is the hard ethic which distinguishes them most sharply from Catholics and from non-reformed Christians. Calvin was by no means an ethical theorist, but no man in history has had a clearer or sharper set of moral ideas than he. His ethic was a lawyer's code based upon precedents in the Bible, and never did Calvin doubt the correctness of his view, nor his duty to impose it upon all men for the glory of God. To hurt and to destroy, he says, are incompatible with the character of the godly. But to avenge the afflictions of the righteous at the command of God is neither to hurt nor to destroy. I sincerely wish that this consideration were constantly in our recollection, that nothing is done here by the temerity of men, but everything by the authority of God, who commands it, and under whose guidance we never err from the right way. Nothing is done here by the temerity of men, everything by the authority of God. See, that's what happens when you think of like predestination and no free will. So I look around and I think God is allowing it. So like think about Our Father. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He's allowing it, but he's not willing it. I mean, I guess thy will be done. Anyway, I believe that we have free will, and he allows free will. And that is why he allows human beings to do bad things. But I also think we're here just to demonstrate. I feel like the world is full of jerks so that we can, and there's no jerks in heaven. And you're here to prove that you're not a jerk, even if everybody else is a jerk. Yes, I know that sounds ridiculous. So overly simplistic, but I think it's plausible. And it certainly makes me feel better about the fact that we're not actually changing the world or saving it from jerks, because this isn't the one. This is the world for jerks. He briefed a powerful driving ethical code for his followers, and it gave them all the energy of prosecuting attorneys in God's battle against wickedness. It was an ethic based upon biblical texts as culled and interpreted by Calvin rather than upon reason, upon the Decalogue, as likewise interpreted and applied by him rather than the Sermon on the Mount. The Bible, Calvin wrote, ought to affect, hold on. I had written this before. Oh yeah, the Decalogue is a Polish drama television miniseries. So he's saying that the Decalogue, like the 10 Commandments versus the 2. Is that what he keeps going back to? The Bible, Calvin wrote, ought to affect the whole man with 100 times more energy than the frigid exhortations of the philosophers. And it did. Certainly and logically, the Calvinists were intolerant to the very marrow of their bones. When Calvin believed that man's sole end in life was to glorify God, that the Bible contained all the rules for doing this work, and that his interpretation of Scripture was the only correct one, then he could not logically be tolerant. Georgia Harkness sees this well when she observes, when one is convinced that God's glory transcends all earthly considerations, and when one is also convinced that God's glory is being fouled in the dust and men's minds poisoned by false doctrine, one can bring himself to kill for God. Calvin's doctrine of persecution was the coolly reasoned product of a theology which combined God's sovereignty, man's littleness, biblical literalism, and Hebraic ethics, all, of course, as interpreted and applied by Calvin. The rise of religious tolerance after Calvin's day owes absolutely nothing to Calvinistic theory. Where they controlled the machinery of persecution, Calvinists were more energetically intolerant than any religious group in modern times. Where they were a minority, however, they devised theories in favor of tolerance, as did Catholics in England or Anabaptists in Switzerland. Champions of toleration did not come from Geneva. I always say that about Russia. Like when Russia is pounding the table for objective human rights and criticizes the Anglo-American empire for their hypocrisy. Like, well, yeah, because when you're the little guy, I mean, they're right, of course, and we should all remember this. When you're the little guy, the rights are all you have to defend yourself. That is what was so great, I think, about the American experiment and why DEI and wokeness or whatever is here to destroy it, because it's too powerful a protection for minorities, whatever you may be. I mean, we're minorities, all of us who want to restore the Constitution, we're a minority. And I'm beginning to think that this whole thing, that all this woke stuff, all top down, that they're really fascists, like the top down people who are, and I know we've said this before. I coined liberal fascist center 25 years ago, 20 years ago. But I think that they're like super elite, intolerant, discriminatory, greedy, feudal, whatever, and that they're going to usher in a world without objective rights. It's going to be different. It's going to be more like a religion, and it's worrying me. Calvin's morality was essentially a lawyer's. It was a purely exterior morality that dealt with acts rather than with desires. Sobriety, frugality, honesty, prudence were all virtues which, in their working out, soon came to be practical and financial rather than spiritual. Sobriety, frugality, honesty, prudence. Okay. Sombart has caught the spirit of the Genevans' ethic in his description of Calvinistic honesty. In essence, this meant, this is a quote, eschew all irregularities, appear in respectable society, avoid drinking, gambling, and women, go to church regularly. In a word, always wear the aspect of true respectability, and all for the sake of your business. Such a moral rule of life will ensure your credit. That's funny. Calvin's ethic was a form of moral mathematics, whereby you could assign your neighbor to heaven or to hell by means of a calculus of his exterior virtues and vices. To his credit would be listed such things as a sober demeanor, a dour countenance, clean apparel, a frugal way of life, unlimited industriousness, dearth of humor, and consuming seriousness about the practical affairs of life. Such a man was a good man. Such a man had evidently been labeled elect by God. Well, that is another big difference with Catholicism, with Catholics. Like that's not part of it. Although my father used to say, if people think that drinking and using vulgarity, we never cursed or swore, but said, if you know somebody who thinks, he used this example. It was so weird. He loved working on his motorcycle. He had a 66 Harley Dresser. So his motorcycle was older than I was. And I think he gave it away because he said he loved it so much, but he wouldn't work on it on Sundays, even though he wanted to. And he loved it because he thought it was scandalous because it looked like work instead of like a hobby. And all sorts of things like that. If somebody doesn't understand the difference between vulgarity and cursing and swearing, you shouldn't use vulgarity in front of them because they think that you're sinning, and that's scandal. So a lot of the stuff goes to that. Just if everybody thinks that these things are, but then, that goes too far. Do you really have to have a dour countenance? No, I was taught that you should have a joyful countenance. So anyway, virtues in the Calvinistic ethic were all those virtues that have been associated with the middle class. Throughout Calvin's writings, there is constant stress on reverence, chastity, honesty, sobriety, industry, and frugality, those virtues which make for much production and small consumption. for the amassing of wealth and for hoarding rather than spending it. Calvin resurrected in perverted form the neglected Catholic virtue of asceticism and self discipline, making it more rigorous than the Catholics ever had and applying it exclusively to mundane matters. Where Catholics before Calvin had insisted that worldly pleasures in their proper place are good and are to be denied only for a higher spiritual good, Calvin insisted things of this world were bad in themselves and had to be avoided as evil. But it's like the first line of Genesis. It's good. Either the earth must become vile in our estimation, he insists, or it must retain our immoderate love. Again, he condemns pleasures of the senses in such sentences as this: those who have much variety in order to satisfy the appetite have surely offended God and ought to be despised. It could be wished that such people had died before they were born. I thought that's when, if you were mean to kids. Where Catholic asceticism had meant withdrawal from the world for contemplation, Calvinist asceticism meant method and discipline in worldly life. Rather than prayer and contemplation, it meant an ascetic life in business and in social relationships. It meant, in the long run, cutting away from all foolishness and lightheadedness that interfered with serious practical business activity. This asceticism is well described by Troeltsch, Troeltsch. Okay, so cut me some slack. Troeltsch has the demand for ascetic conduct and of work activity as the best means of spiritual and corporal discipline, the utmost simplicity of life with regard to clothing and comfort, the practical capacity, assurance, and honor in all callings, which will lead to a very practical social, political, and business activity. Frugality was treated by Calvin and his followers as a necessary virtue. The frugal life is the saintly life. Extravagance, a manifestation of ambition and pride, is a devilish thing. Maybe. The elect are to receive God's blessings, it is true, but Calvin reminds his followers that when God sends prosperity, the affluence of our blessings is to try our frugality. It's to tempt you? Okay. The elect must know how to live penuriously, no matter what material blessings God has sent their way. The Calvinist cannot be guilty of ostentatious waste or even of unbecoming display. To restrain ourselves in the midst of abundance is a virtue well pleasing to God and reveals a grateful heart. But look, this is clearly a social, political philosophy, cultural change that was promoted. I mean, I don't see where it says that, but it had to have been promoted. It would not have caught on. It is too beneficial to whatever class was benefiting from the surplus. Maybe it was a king and his own country, Geneva, the city. I don't know. But I remember this about Jose Maria Escrivar, the Opus Dei guy. He's called a saint, but I think that the canonization process was not quite right. So I'll have to reserve judgment on that. But I believe that he worked for Franco and in Spain, and they were trying to get people to work harder. So they brought some of this. There's like a kind of a morality that they brought to get people to work harder. And it was promoted by the state because that's what the state wanted. Okay. Industriousness, labor for its own sake, is another virtue stressed by the great reformer. Calvin was temperamentally opposed to any kind of softness, and idleness was for him a vicious form of softness. Troll. I'm trying to figure out that guy's name, Troeltsch. To restrain ourselves in the midst of abundance is a virtue well pleasing to God and reveals a grateful heart. Okay, I already did that. It is certain, he avers, that idleness and indolence are accursed of God. And in one of his most frequently quoted passages, he tells us that nothing is more unseemly than a man that is idle and good for nothing. And I can think of a lot of unseemly things, to be honest with you. I find the immodest like extremely immodest dress in public and like, gluttony, stuff like that, unseemly. But idle and good for nothing isn't great either. All right, work for its own sake as a sign of salvation seems to have impressed itself most deeply upon Calvin's associates and on his followers. And Harkness sums it up. The injunction bore its fruits. The combination of frugality with industry made for thrift, and thrift for the amassing of riches. Then, with the heaping up of riches, came the care of this world and the undoing of much for which Calvin labored. He means the care of this world, like people cared about it then. And that's materialism ultimately. Yeah. Forest Mommy saying teenage girls wear thongs to the water park. Yeah, no, it's really messed up. And what they get off of TikTok is that if anybody notices it, they are the ones who are gross and weird. I'm dead serious. I mean, bleh. But you know what I think about TikTok is porn for girls. Like the way they got girls to be like, have that lust, that thirst for porn was to make them the objects of it. Cause that's what they, that's like, I would say the female equivalent. I don't know. Weird. Calvin briefed the purely capitalistic businessman's ethic. It remained his ethic throughout modern history, with further secularization and with Calvin's limiting counsels forgotten. Yes, the mothers need to stop it. Forest Mommy's like, I get why the girls are doing it. Yeah, but somebody needs to stop it. One of my friends from Georgia sent me just a screenshot of a conversation that was happening in their like Facebook local thing. And it was some mother saying, I'm new to the area. My child identifies as a Theron, like a furry. And I'm trying to find like other furries for this kid to hang out with. I'm like, thank God in heaven you're in a place that does not have furry children. Run with that. Oh, maybe Semiclegia says maybe Calvin was purifying the black nobility. I don't understand, Semiclegia, what you're saying about the Venetians and the Swiss. Yeah. I was kind of strict about that, but I sent the kids to a school that was kind of strict because I felt like you have to be supported by your community in that way. And they get kind of mad at me now, but they aren't gross. So, and I've always said that, like, I would rather my kids be on the couch, the psychiatrist couch, because they hate me than because they hate themselves. So go ahead, wear clothing and hate me for it. That's fine. I'm willing to accept that. Okay. Calvin's justification of the capitalistic spirit, already in existence, but not yet given full social approval. So we're talking this was 500 years ago, 450, was perhaps his most significant accomplishment. More than justifying the capitalistic spirit, he gave it impetus and promoted several of the essential ingredients on which capitalism could build and thrive. Okay, so whether you're Calvinist or Catholic and you like or don't like the way this guy approaches Calvinism or Calvin the person, the reason we're reading this is this kind of stuff. Like, how did this become a building block of modern, I'm not going to say society, but thought, Okay. In the first place, as we have seen, he advocated through example and precept the cultivation of the middle class virtues, prudence, industry, frugality, sobriety, honesty. Prudence, industry, frugality, sobriety, honesty. Second, he advanced the doctrine that all material goods are bestowed on their possessors directly by God. That seems impossible. A belief that connoted a sanctity of private property which has plagued mankind since his day. Uh, excuse me, Mr. Neal, but I have to expand my mind a little bit when it comes to this kind of stuff. I'm so ingrained a libertarian, but I do understand the Georgist argument that land itself cannot be owned. I'm not saying it works. And I think the way we get around that is the rule against perpetuity so that you cannot control land beyond the grave. But we've talked about that before. It's my favorite rule, the rule against perpetuities. All right. Let's see what he means by the sanctity of private property, which has plagued mankind. For among the descendants of Calvin, private property is more hallowed than the human beings who possess it or from whom it is taken. It is a belief that came to absolve the unscrupulous of the means they used to obtain property. For after all, it was bestowed by God, and if God willed that the reprobate be foolish and the elect prosper, who is the businessman to acquire into the ineffable will of God? Does that mean you can cheat and steal? Third, Calvin insisted on the virtue of obedience. Servants were told to submit to their masters, and workers were enjoined to obey their employers. This insistence on obedience, combined with the virtue of industry, helped make for a hardworking, passive class of employees, an essential factor in the centuries to come for the commercial and industrial revolutions. Yeah, I was taught, and you could go to Catholic confession right now, and they will tell you that honor thy father and thy mother, that the sin you can, if you're doing the long form confession, which I've had to do a few times after being away for I could tell you some embarrassing stories about that. But in any case, they'll go through each thing like thou shalt not kill. Have you ever driven somebody to an abortion clinic? If even if you haven't done it yourself, did you ever help them pay for it or anything like that? They say under the father and thy mother thing, legitimate authority falls under that. So if you have to give a good day's work. You certainly can't steal from your employer, for example. You can't steal from anybody, but it would be like a double sin because they have legitimate authority because you have accepted a job from them. I mean, it's true, they have legitimate authority, but it's interesting that, I mean, that work comes as a part of that. I mean, I'm not objecting to it. It's just seems like the origins might have been here. Okay. It is not mere concomitance of circumstances that caused these revolutions to occur most fruitfully in Calvinistic countries, nor is it mere accident that employers interested in the religion of their workers sought to propagate some form or another of Calvinism among them. In the fourth place, Calvin permitted the taking of interest. Well, now we know why this guy was promoted, a point which, it seems, has been too much emphasized by economic historians. Oh, the capitalistic Calvinistic spirit, which he generated, would soon have gotten around the problem of interest anyway. Moreover, Catholic theorists had found many grounds to justify the taking of interest by Calvin's time. Calvin, nevertheless, was the first to justify interest in itself, though he stringently forbade his followers charging excessive rates or taking any from the poor. Finally, more than Luther had done before him, Calvin invested the secular calling or vocation with a religious significance. The shoemaker and the farmer are doing the Lord's work as directly as is the preacher. Yeah, I think that's like a Opus Dei thing, which I'm sure they got from this. Okay. The Lord commands every one of us, Calvin wrote, in all the actions of his life to regard his vocation. He has appointed to all their particular duties in different spheres of life. and that no one might rashly transgress the limits prescribed, he has styled such spheres of life vocations or callings. Every individual's line of life, therefore, is, as it were, a post assigned him by the Lord. One who feels he is doing the Lord's work as he makes shoes will make more shoes and better shoes than if he works only for his supper. Dude, I think I started this by saying, like, I just love to do the dishes and call it prayer. Like, honestly, I must be very seriously ingrained with this Protestant work ethic. The religious significance Calvin gave to secular work helps explain the almost superhuman energy with which captains of industry have carried on in modern times. The Latin American, who is bewildered by the Yankees' terrifying energy, does not appreciate the effects of the institutes of the Christian religion on the modern mind. That's the name of the book. So let's just think about this for a second, because I was just talking about this, and I've talked about it before, but I was just talking about it today with my son. Like, I feel like it was the fact that the church competed with the state that gave the individual a sense of individualism and may have led to the kind of innovation, entrepreneurship, whatever, that gave the West, Europe, an advantage, even though if you put any stock in IQ tests or whatever, if you go further east from the Middle East, India, China, Japan, it all gets like higher IQ. And China had an older civilization, but I think basically every place had the church and the state together, mixed together. And then after Luther, that happened here. But I was thinking that the Industrial Revolution would never have happened in Europe if it hadn't been for that original true separation of church and state, or subordination of state to an independent church that had nothing to do with the nation. I don't know. But the timing it could just as easily be Calvin. Although I bet we've already made quite a few strides that marked a social and economic sophistication in Europe that, they probably were already pacing China, for example. Like, China had those great inventions, but they suppressed them because they wanted to keep their hierarchy in place. Kind of like the report from Iron Mountain. Anyway, like Luther, Calvin gave political advice to his followers. Like Luther's, Calvin's political theories were in favor of established rule and against rebellion. No Stuart, it has been observed, ever proclaimed more vigorously the divine right of kings and magistrates to govern. As James I was, in a short time, to speak almost mystically of the divinity that doth hedge a king, so Calvin proclaimed that civil magistracy is a calling not only holy and legitimate, but far the most sacred and honorable in human life. Obedience is due even to wicked rulers, for they are visited upon men as a punishment for their sins. Are you kidding me? They are, moreover, God's representatives on earth, and one cannot resist the magistrate without resisting God. This is going too far. Too far. What about Pol Pot? Really? But at the same time, Calvin pushed a wedge into the authority of the prince, through which legions of revolutionists were to march. We are subject to the men who rule over us, he had written, but subject only in the Lord. If they command anything against him, let us not pay the least regard to it, nor be moved by all the dignity which they possess as magistrates. This had long been taught by Catholic moralists, but the followers of Calvin gave the command a new significance. For the Calvinist had identified himself with the Lord. He is the Lord's agent, one of God's elect. And if the prince commands him to act in a way he does not want to, that prince is issuing a command against the Lord. Even here, of course, Calvin sanctioned only passive resistance. But his advice, rather to spit on their heads than to obey them, was taken literally and made a justification for rebellion in Scotland and England, the Netherlands and France, and indirectly in America too. So I guess maybe when the Catholic Church was still had power, you would appeal to the church or look to the church for guidance. And here, when you're the arbiter of right and wrong, you can just say, fade this, as my mother would say. Fade that. Calvin's teaching resulted in attitudes and actions he could never have dreamed of. First, and perhaps most important, we're on section 4 of the Calvin chapter. First, and perhaps most important, it created a race of hard men, men who would control European politics and business for centuries to come. Men who ruthlessly bent all opposition to their indomitable wills. Men who believed with the Whig Mackintosh that their class had the largest share of sense and virtue. Until recent decades, the middle classes were an iron race among the people of Europe and America, and their hardness derived largely from Calvinist theory. The Puritan spirit, according to an eminent Canadian authority, A.S.P. Woodhouse, nerved the arm and brought an excess of courage, which on any other premise would have been reckless. This was a restless, dynamic spirit Calvin forged, and its possessors moved forever like the sea in an otherwise relatively placid European society. This active, practical temper feared rest and quiet as Luther feared the dark. In his famous book of advice, Christian Directory, Baxter summed up the Calvinist Puritan feeling when he asserted, "It is action that God is most served and honored by." Henry Robinson, in like manner, told his readers, "The true temper and proper employment of a Christian is always to be working like the sea and purging ignorance out of his understanding and exchanging notions and apprehensions imperfect for more perfect and forgetting things behind to press forward." Milton raised this restlessness to a higher plane, to be still searching what we know not by what we know, still closing truth to truth as we find it. This is the golden rule in theology as well as in arithmetic. This is nobler than Baxter, perhaps, but Milton's is an equally restless spirit. Second, Calvinist theory armed the middle class with the strongest of all weapons, a powerful idea, and sent them into the world as revolutionary reformers. The Calvinist had to strain every nerve, every muscle to make sound doctrine and good morality prevail in every nook and cranny of life, from the king's chamber to the farmer's dining room. Reform must be accomplished everywhere, in the counting house and the tavern, in the meeting house and the living room. The word of God must prevail throughout the world. Such was the mission of the elect. Sometimes this meant revolution, sometimes it meant drastic legal reform, sometimes social reform, again, a cleanup campaign. Calvinist groups have been leaders for reform of any kind, good or bad, through modern history. The Puritan, Thomas Case, chanted the old reform refrain to the House of Commons when he cried, "Reform the universities, reform the cities, the counties, the Sabbath, the ordinances, the worship of God. Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up." Reform of various kinds was accomplished. Here, 1 second. Hold on. Sorry. Hold on. Oh, I was thinking of sobriety. So, of course, I mean, when you're chilling, like you're not only off the clock, but you're not going to be as industrious the next day. It might shorten your life, it might lengthen your life, but as far as your day-to-day industriousness, I imagine sobriety is going to make you more productive. Okay. Reform of various kinds was accomplished. But at the same time, and again, largely because of John Calvin, society came to be impersonalized as it never had been before in human history. In the Genevan system, every man stands isolated from his fellows. Each is a lonely warrior against iniquity, with only God on his side. All struggle is for God's honor and glory. Thus, the socially warming quality of brotherly love was looked on as a religious weakness, No one should be logically concerned with his fellow creatures for their sake. Any concern with mankind is an impersonalized, legalistic concern that they conform to the will of God in their outward actions. Calvin had himself systematically eliminated Christ's regard for man as a human person. He had neglected the second of the two great commandments, without which society is almost bound to be organized in filing cabinets and card indexes, as it is today. See, when you have Catholics talking like that, and this is probably why I didn't like this guy, it sounds like what you're saying is we need a welfare state. And I think it's always important to say, and I believe it's in that book, The Church and the Libertarian, that the government can't be responsible for it because they have to steal from you, and if you don't let them steal from you, they will kill you, to give it to other people, and there's no transparency, there's no accountability as to that person's what they're using it for, and it takes away all virtue from you because you're not giving it freely. So yes, reinforce the idea that we are responsible for that second commandment of Christ, that we are responsible for the other person, and make that a priority. Make it absolutely a priority, but it's not a collective. It's not a coercive collective. It's not in the purview of the state. And I think that gets lost. And so you listen to this and it sounds like social Catholic teaching, which I do want to learn more about. It's hard for me to digest it since I was raised so libertarian, depending on what it really says. And the Pope Francis, Papa Frank, is the first one who ever outwardly said, as far as I could tell, really stated the government needs to redistribute wealth. I could not identify Pope actually saying that before. And I would have to say he's wrong. Calvinists and Puritans, therefore, naturally, though unintentionally perhaps, changed their attitude towards social obligations. This is really important. For the first time, a social and moral taint was attached to poverty. The term beggar began to take on the unsavory connotation it still has today, where formerly mendicant priests and university students plied the begging trade with high self-respect. In England, for example, where enclosures had been condemned as vicious social evils by Thomas More and his contemporaries, a century later, Baxter and his friends encouraged enclosures as a method to put the lower classes under severe masters who would establish good moral discipline among them. Common lands were condemned as evil, for they encouraged the worst sin of all, idleness. Arthur Young smugly summed it all up late in the next century when he pontificated, "Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor or they will never be industrious." Yikes. I think we're living that. I think progressive taxation makes it pretty clear that the more you can produce, the more they have to take away from you because the more they need you to produce, but also the more you get to keep. I mean, we are truly tax slaves, truly. A third major result of Calvin's theological and moral doctrines is found in their application to business life. It is perhaps the first systematic body of religious teaching, Tony writes, which can be said to recognize and applaud the economic virtues. Such teaching, whatever its theological merits or defects, was admirably designed to liberate economic energies and to weld into a disciplined social force the rising bourgeoisie, conscious of the contrast between its own standards and those of a laxer world, proud of its vocation as the standard bearer of the economic virtues, and determined to vindicate an open road for its own way of life by the use of every weapon, including political revolution and war, because the issue which was at stake was not merely convenience or self-interest, but the will of God. The issue, okay. Yeah, the standard bearer of economic, and proud, to be proud of it. To be proud of it is highly motivating, I have observed. Neither the Bank of England nor Wall Street was foreseen by Calvin, but he made easier the creation of both. The connection between his teaching and the new capitalistic world was observed almost at once. Spaniards spoke of the intimate connection between Calvinism and the commercial spirit of the revolting Netherlanders in the late 16th century. Baxter mentioned France in the next century, where it was, quote, the merchants and the middle sort of men that were Protestants. And a Puritan pamphleteer of 1671 wrote, there is a kind of natural unaptness in the popish religion to business. Whereas, on the contrary, among the Reformed, the greater their zeal, the greater their inclination to trade and industry. The Calvinist was called to practice his business with an almost inhuman seriousness. Business was no longer a task, it became a passion. The Puritan divine Richard Steele told his readers that the great governor of the world hath appointed to every man his proper post and province, and let him be never so active out of his sphere, he will be at a great loss if he do not keep his own vineyard and mind his own business. Well, minding your own business sounds right, but I didn't realize it was like that literal. It was unseemly indeed, the Puritans were told, to spend too much time in prayer when the same time could be profitably spent in business. Thus, the followers of Calvin glorified work as it had never been glorified before. Work was good, both as an end in itself and as a means of amassing wealth. Baxter's advice was typical. Be wholly taken up in diligent business of your lawful callings, when you are not exercised in the more immediate service of God. Keep up a high esteem of time, and be every day more careful that you lose none of your time than you are that you lose none of your gold and silver. The wealthy are not excused from the duty of labor, for in the words of Richard Steele, the standing pool is prone to putrefaction, and it were better to beat down the body and to keep it in subjection by a laborious calling than through luxury to become a castaway. Work is for the sake not only of the soul, but also for obtaining wealth. Baxter tells his readers that it is sinful to choose the less gainful of two possible transactions. And Wesley says bluntly, we must exhort all Christians to gain all they can and so save all they can. That is, in effect, to grow rich. What about the whole eye of the needle thing? A camel in the eye of the needle. Labor, then, is a duty for all. It must be hard, diligent labor that purifies the soul and makes money. It must be systematized labor that is the result of ruthless self-discipline. It is an industriousness that admits of no idleness, no laxity, no rest. Remember, Ben Franklin told his young tradesmen that time is money. Thus it follows that since the good work incessantly and live frugally, the good shall prosper. Virtue is more than its own reward. It pays off in dollars and cents. The Puritan pamphleteer Young summed up the connection between godliness and wealthiness pithily. No question, but it, riches, should be the portion rather of the godly than of the wicked, were it good for them. For godliness hath the promise of this life as well as the life to come. The part played by Calvinism in making the commercial and industrial world now dissolving is summed up succinctly by Troelsch in this paragraph. When all is said and done, Calvinism I just watched The Anchorman, Ron Burgundy. So, and of course, we usually watch Elf over Christmas. So it's fun to say Troelsch. When all is said and done, Calvinism remains the real nursing father of the civic industrial capitalism of the middle classes. Self-devotion to work and gain, which constitutes the involuntary and unconscious asceticism of the modern man, is the child of a conscious intramundane asceticism of work and calling inspired by religious motives. I'm realizing now this was written in the 50s. I think we're post this. We're post the Calvinist work ethic, but I mean, it's hard to purge a societal mind. The spirit of the calling, which does not reach out beyond the world, but works in the world without creative worship, that is, without love of the world, becomes the parent of a tireless, systematic laboriousness in which work is sought for work's sake, for the sake of the mortification of the flesh. Man, I am guilty of this stuff. In which the produce of the work serves not to be consumed in enjoyment, but to the constant reproduction of the capital employed. Well, that's not me. Since the aggressively active ethic inspired by the doctrine of predestination urges the elect to the full development of his God given powers, work becomes rational and systematic. In breaking down the motive of ease and enjoyment, asceticism lays the foundation of the tyranny of work over men. That was Trollsch. Okay, we're going to wrap it up now. If voluntarism was the chief result of Luther's doctrine, Puritanism was the main fruit of Calvin's. Luther's voluntarism was soon checked by a long age of rationalism, but it went on living beneath the surface of Western society, and it cropped out to flourish in the 19th and 20th centuries. Calvin's Puritanism, on the other hand, always rode high on the crest of Western society. And there was hardly a man of affairs after Calvin's day who escaped his influence. Calvin's influence on the modern mind is not as direct as that of Rousseau or Marx or Freud, but it is more extensive, more penetrating. It is harder to escape. So maybe I'm wrong. Long ago, John Adams warned, "Let not Geneva be forgotten or despised." Even today, his warning cannot be ignored. Man, this book is kind of deep. I think you have to be like a little bit better read than I am to totally get the whole thing. Anyway, well, that was super fun. Thank you for joining me. Next is going to be part 5, which here is chapter 4, Descartes, Pure Reason's Failure. Descartes, Cartesian, whatever. I can't wait. I don't love the religious stuff. I don't love it. So the Luther and Calvin, I get it, changed everything, but I want to move beyond that. So I'm really looking forward to next time. I thank you all so much for coming and for the great conversations. And they're very distracting, but anyway, until next time, thanks so much, guys.